Good morning. The Institute of Advanced Studies of Unifesp is pleased to welcome Professor Kapil Raj, who is one of the leading scholars in the history of science today. I would like to greet the audience and thank everyone for coming. I'm sure that we will have an excellent morning. Eu gostaria de agradecer bastante a audiência pela presença aqui, agradecer muito a presença do professor Kapil, que é um dos principais especialistas em História da Ciência hoje. Gostaria de desejar uma ótima manhã para nós todos. Eu vou passar a palavra para a Isabela, que é pós-doutoranda aqui na Unifesp, bolsista da FAPESP. Ela vai apresentar o professor Kapil e depois passar a palavra para ele. Muito obrigada a todos e um bom dia para todos nós. Isabela, por favor.
Obrigada. Vou iniciar a apresentação em inglês, em seguida em português. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here in this streaming conference. And I want to give a special thanks for Professor Raj for accepting give us this lecture, and to Professor Anna that managed all the necessary affairs to do it. We are really delighted to have with us Professor Raj, that currently is a distinguished professor at the School of Advanced Studies in Social Science in Paris, France. Professor Raj is a renowned expert in the field of history of science, publishing numerous papers and books, among which we would like to highlight Relocating Modern Science, Circulation and the Construction of Science Knowledge in South Asia and Europe between 1650 to 1900. In his extensive work, Professor Raj confers centrality to the circulation of knowledge, seen as a fundamental part of the knowledge-making process. Professor Raj also challenges the centrality conferred upon Western science and European science, standing how local agents, objects, and plural ways of knowing are equally important in the production of knowledge. So, Professor Raj, now I will introduce you in Portuguese, and then the floor will be yours. Just a second, please. Olá, bom dia. Eu gostaria de desejar um bom dia para a nossa audiência e agradecer a presença de todos, agradecer a presença do professor Kapil Raj, da professora Ana, que organizou esse evento, e dizer que nós estamos muito felizes em recebê-lo e que o professor Raj é professor titular na Escola de Estudos Avançados em Ciências Sociais, em Paris, na França. O professor Raj é um pesquisador amplamente conhecido na área de História das Ciências, publicou numerosos artigos e livros relevantes. Entre eles, a gente pode destacar o ainda não traduzido Relocating Modern Science, Circulation and the Construction of Science Knowledge in South Asia and Europe, 1650 until 1900. Ao longo do seu extenso trabalho, o professor Raj confere centralidade à circulação de conhecimento, considerando a parte fundamental do processo de produção desse conhecimento científico. O professor Raj também critica a centralidade conferida à ciência ocidental europeia, destacando como agentes locais, formas plurais de elaboração de conhecimento, são igualmente importantes para se pensar a ciência e a sua história. So, well, the presentations are finished here. Professor Raj, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Well, hello, everybody. I can't see anyone, but still, I'm talking to you all. Hi. First and foremost, I'd love to thank my colleague Anna Nemi and UNICEF for this invitation, very kind, and also for Isabella for her introduction, her very kind and generous introduction to me and my work. So before further ado, let me just now start. about with telling you a little bit about the title of and explaining the title of my talk today, which is Knowledge and Objects in Circulation. And what does this mean? So let's look at the word circulation to start off with, because normally the word circulation has a very common meaning, which is things that just move around. It's like money, money circulates. So I give you something and I take something in exchange, and then this is a token and it keeps moving around. And the more something circulates, the more it's supposed to be popular, the more it's successful. But in the process of circulation, what circulates does not change, because, I mean, that's a fundamental given for circulation. Like money, if money started changing in form or in value as it moved, then it would be very difficult to control it. Now, this is not the meaning that I and my colleagues who thought this out a little bit with me want to give to the word circulation. It's a slightly different meaning, and let me start by saying where it comes from, what the problem is, and why I chose this word, circulation, for what I want to do. So, as an historian of science, as you know, I come from India. That's where I grew up. That's where I studied before I came to France and did my doctorate in the history of science in France. But before that, I grew up and went to university in India. And when we look, I mean, it's very much like you all in Brazil. The story is, the narrative always is that what we have, what was called modern science, comes from Europe. And when it comes from Europe, in other words, it's diffused, it's spread from Europe to the world. And it circulates pretty much like money circulates, exactly. So it moves from one place to another. The more it moves, the more successful it is, and the less it moves, the less successful it is. But also, if it doesn't move too much, it's also the problem of people like us from India or from Brazil or from wherever, who are stupid or idiots and don't want to accept the universality of modern science. So there are impediments to its circulation. But basically, the process is a process of what we call diffusion, very much like money, very much like products, like anything that you buy in a shop. It's the same thing that you can buy in Brazil as you can buy in Africa or in Europe or in Asia. And the more, as I said, these things travel, or the more popular they are, the more successful they are. But we never look at what happens when things move. I'll come to that in a minute. But before that, let me just concentrate on this idea of what we call diffusion, this diffusionist notion of circulation. So we have somewhere which is, which produces things, and other places which receive things. Now, in my own work, I started as a I did my first degree was in mathematics and physics. And even as a student, not only for me, but for all my colleagues, this was a difficult idea to accept, that everything actually just comes from Europe and then gets accepted, appropriated by others. Because that's not the way in which we ourselves experienced what we were doing at the university. Things were being taught to us slightly differently. We were understanding things differently. We know, for instance, that in the Indian contribution to modern physics or even mathematics is quite peculiar. It's not like what Europeans practice when they do mathematics. So there is an element of an idiosyncratic element involved in the history of, in the circulation of knowledge. In other words, people are producing things, they're taking things, they're modifying them, and so there's a lot of, it's not a simple process of just something being emitted by an emitter and received by radio or by human beings as good knowledge. So that was one thing that was very unsatisfying. As I started doing more work, I also realized that it's not as, the people have thought of this problem. It's not as if no one has ever thought of this. And there's another approach, which is mainly a Marxist approach. Its author, its main proponent was a person called Joseph Needham, who was a biologist and became interested in the history of science as and how he got interested in China. And finally, so he lived all through the 20th century. He was born in 1900 and he died in 1995. So during this period, which is also the period of the development of the history of science, because the history of science is a fairly recent subject. Its beginnings are also around the beginning of the 20th century, and it becomes a university subject only after the Second World War. So people are thinking about this question of, how do things move around? What is universality? And so against this idea of simple diffusion, Needham had another approach. And he said that, things, that it's not as if science just comes, not born from nowhere in Europe. He had studied China and he was quite amazed at the amount of scientific prowess that the Chinese had. Do tell me, I'm sorry, I just want to interrupt over here to ask, am I speaking too fast? Can you hear me? Are there any difficulties? If not, I'll carry on.
Okay, Professor.
Okay. So, but please tell me if I'm speaking too fast or if, if the sound isn't correct. Okay.
Okay, but it's great.
Okay. So Needham's idea was, was different. He said, every society produces knowledge. And this knowledge moves around from one place to another because, well, of trade, like China, China produced just so many things that we all use, like paper, printing, gunpowder, just to name a few things, or the clock for keeping time. And all these come from China in a way. So his question was that if there are so many other societies which are producing things, why was modern science then, why is it associated just with Europe? And being a Marxist, or very close to Marxism, he came up with an answer which was that modern science is basically linked to capitalism. Why is it linked to capitalism? Because it is quantitative. We quantify things, there are numbers, and numbers are just so much an integral part of capitalism because that's what capitalists do, they count. So modern science is a quantified way of expressing what other people know, and that's why, since capitalism was born in Europe, that's why science is associated with Europe. But he says that's not, it's not because it's born there that it is European. It comes from everywhere, and then it gets, again, for him, it spreads, it gets diffused once it is in Europe. So what he's trying to show is that knowledge is universal, it moves around because it's universal, but it's born in Europe because quite simply, capitalism was born in Europe. It just so happened if capitalism was born elsewhere, then it would have been science would have been born elsewhere too. That's all. Now, neither of these perspectives is really very satisfying. Uh, as I said, in both cases, you finally land up with this idea of diffusion. That once you have something which is called knowledge, then it moves around and the objects associated with it move around. And if they don't move, then it's the fault of the people who don't want to receive it. They're backward, they're stupid, there's something missing in them, they're not rational, or they're just quite simply not modern. And so you have to bring them up to scale. So you have to modernize them, you have to rationalize, you have to teach them how to think rationally. And once you do all that, then people can get, then science will move freely. Now, as I said, I had my own experience. I'm not going to go in great detail into why I began to very closely think of these things. But just very, very simply, the thing is that, I'm an Indian, but there are other Indians who are very different from me. People who live in villages, people who are in a different part of the country. And I'm very well westernized in a way. I speak English. That was my mother tongue. So living in a country, I am more westernized than other people. And then my question became, what is going on over here? How is this change taking place? How come that I begin to think differently from other people if they're not, if they don't have rationality, why do I have rationality? Where does this come from? And going deeper into this question, I began to see that historically, it wasn't as if Indians were basically backward. They were recognizing exactly what was happening. They were taking things, they were modifying them, especially knowledge, objects of knowledge, practices, books being translated very early on. But the translations were not exactly like the original. There was always transformations taking place. So slowly my question then became, what is happening over here? What happens when knowledge moves? It's not that knowledge, for one thing, this was my question. I'll come a little later to how this meets up with the basic problems of the historian that the historian of science faces. So the question then became, what happens when things move? Are they just taken up like money, like a book that you read and then you move it, you give it back to the library, it goes to someone else, or you buy it or you lend it to someone and it just moves around? Or is there transformations taking place over here? And through my own examples that I started looking at by working in archives and doing closer research, I found that there's a big difference, a substantial difference between something that starts and its end result. I also began to see how, in the practice of my physicist colleagues and my mathematician colleagues, this was more or less the same thing even today. When they go from one university to another, when they go from one institution to another, from one laboratory to another, they're not just carrying whatever they have with them and diffusing this to others. In fact, they're talking to other people, discussing, and there are processes of negotiation. In other words, knowledge is being negotiated. So then I got very interested in the beginnings of the encounter with Europe and India, which was also, which was also a European colony at one point. It has a very different history from the history of Brazil, but nonetheless, what we share is that there were that the imperial uh, systems were European systems, and it was within these that the two nations or these two colonies, which later became nations, emerged. And if you start looking at this process closely right from the beginning, you begin to see that people either come with knowledge or come with very little knowledge of things that they want. People looking for plants have very little knowledge of the plants they're going to find. As you know, the flora in India, like in Brazil, is very different from European flora, and they don't know what they're looking for really. So they're in the hands of local people who also, who have knowledge of their own environment. And finally, what we see in these botanical texts and natural history texts is not just European knowledge. It is something which is negotiated, which is talked about, where people are trying to understand each other. And it is the result of this understanding that creates this new knowledge, which we then call natural history, or, well, even navigation or whatever. Anything which has to do with moving, and knowledge which is in movement, and is also being made and also being transformed in this movement. So then this suggests something about the very word circulation. Because circulation, as I said, we take circulation to be just movement. It's a synonym for movement. But if you actually look at the etymology of the word circulation, it means something which is going and coming back. It moves, it's a circle. And it is in this process of going and coming back that you want to see what changes, what transforms. And through this, you begin to see that the only voices are not European voices. There are many other voices, there are many other practices, there are many other uh, uh, inputs, which every time something moves, changes the nature of what is moving. It also changes the nature of the people who are practicing. After all, they also begin to see things slightly differently on both sides. Not just Europeans who are seeing things differently, but people in contact with them are also seeing things differently. However, as I said, both Brazil and India were colonies. In other words, there was power asymmetries. It's not as if everyone is sitting around and trying to discuss all these things without any kind of constraint. There are hierarchies over here. There's power. There's coercion. And this means that what is being negotiated is not equally negotiated on all sides. Voices are not heard in the same way. But yet they are heard. It's not as if they're not heard at all. It's not a binary. It's not yes or no. There are different degrees in which all these things are taking place. And the idea, the notion then of circulation gives you the opportunity as an historian to restitute, to put back these voices and put back the inequality of the voices at the same time. Not to idealize the situation, but to open it up and see what people are, and so this gives all these different voices start coming in. How does this happen? you'll ask me, well, I mean, where are these voices? How do you find them? Are you the one who's inventing these voices? No. If you start looking closely into the archive, reading documents very closely, you know that people who are writing these things, mainly Europeans, because indigenous people or people outside of Europe do not perhaps write everything that they do. And since it's Europeans who are actually accumulating this knowledge, they're also writing about it and writing about their experiences. And in this, when you begin to read these texts closely, you see how many different voices start coming up. You begin to see that there's not just one person, but there's someone else. There's a translator, there's a guide, there are people who are hostile. You have to negotiate with them, otherwise they won't show you things. And you begin to see that there are different interests involved also in these negotiations. Why is someone interested in giving you? No one gives you things free. As the English expression goes, there's no free lunch. If someone invites you for lunch and you don't pay for it, you're going to pay for it at some point elsewhere. And this, you begin to see how then things are partially given, not totally given. Sometimes they're not quite what they're supposed to be. But then people are trying to tease these things out, and saying, okay, it's like this, and then, maybe, and what is the difference between this and that? And so some form of stable knowledge begins to emerge. And these are then you see that there's a process involved over here. Knowledge is not something which is made instantaneously. It's a whole process. It gets stabilized, then it gets published. And even when it gets published in Europe, the printers and publishers do not publish what people actually write. Here again, in the process of circulation, the people who are actually involved in circulating things, they're very much like publishers today. If you give a book to someone, to a publishing house, they try to change your title. They'd say, no, this chapter won't work. Why don't you write it this way or that way? And so there, again, these are other forms of negotiation. And you begin to see that negotiation has many, many, many meanings. As things move from one milieu to another milieu, they're also changing. So this was one way in which I started looking at circulation, and this was my early work. But then, as an historian of science, I was also talking and interacting with other historians of science, people of my age, of my group. I became an historian of science in the 80s. And the history of science was, in fact, being transformed at exactly the same period. So, and the transformations that were taking place in the history of science were really earth-shaking. Why? So, early history of science understood science as something which was positive. In other words, knowledge was like a brick. So, and the world's knowledge was like a big building. So you had individual bricks, and these bricks put together made larger and larger knowledge. And finally, the hope was that we'd have everything in this huge big building called knowledge. This is what we call positivism. In other words, brick by brick, things are cumulative. And they move from one place to another just because, as I said earlier, because they're true. And if so, the onus lies on you to accept something. If you don't want to, then it's your problem, basically. Science is objective and it's true. What happened in the 1980s, 1970s and 1980s was that this notion, this positivist notion of knowledge started getting eroded. I mean, it got eroded long before this, but people began very seriously to think about what was happening over here. And they reversed the whole process of thinking about what knowledge was. So, knowledge, they said, was always local. It was being made in some place. It had its own roots over there. And then the question was, how do you make this knowledge move? Because it's in your interest, actually, to make other people accept what you're doing. And this is not because of the property of knowledge itself, it is because of what you do, what your efforts are in order to make this knowledge move. You have to convince other people, you have to go to conferences, you have to talk, you have to, there are resistances to things. And finally, people object to what you're saying, and you have to look at your stuff again. You have to go back to the drawing board. You have to examine documents. You have to examine your own work, your own data. You have to talk to other people. You have to read other people's work and integrate all that. So here again, a negotiation processes. And if your article or your work gets accepted, then more people will look at it. But the price that you're paying for this is that it's no longer your initial work. You're always modifying things. Even when one of us writes a paper and sends it off for publication, the referees write back and say, okay, it's a very good idea, but, and they give you a long list of things to look into, to change. So here you find, again, that even that prior to making things move, you already have to negotiate even in today's world. So, and here I began to find that there was a big convergence between my world, which was a world of intercultural encounter between geographically separate cultures, that in fact, this problem is much more general than a question of large distances, physical distance. It's also between people who work very close to each other, that we are always trying to change and get our ideas accepted by others. And this, you have to pay a price for this. And this is very similar to the price that people were paying earlier on. And here again, power structures come in, very much so. And the more I read this, the more I began to understand that basically the basic problem of the history of science today is this question of circulation. So people propose different strategies. There are a number of strategies that are proposed. Some people are saying, you have to convince others, like, for instance, Bruno Latour with actor network theory, that you have to convince more and more people. So it's your conviction, your art of rhetoric that changes and makes your ideas move. For others, it is you have to standardize your equipment. So if you have to convince someone that if you are measuring temperature, then it's better to use my thermometer than to use yours, because my thermometer is more reliable. That the scales that I'm using, for instance, centigrade, is a scale which can move from one place to another. My thermometer moves with it. And as my thermometer moves, you begin also to follow my units of measure. And once you follow my units of measure, then your capacity to negotiate becomes smaller, because then we're talking about the same thing. We're not talking about different things. So there are various strategies of making people converge on, and to use. So finally, then circulation becomes the basic problem of the history of science and of science studies, basically. So it's not, And this is how today, so within this, I've done a lot of work. My work has always been not general. I don't like, sort of big theory work. I always work on case studies. And I try to illuminate things, go from the case outwards to see what world people are living in, how things are being negotiated, what negotiations mean, what are the power structures, how are these power structures also being reconfigured in these processes, and what is the world. So I want to then make the world in which people live at any time, in the past as much as in the present, intelligible to us, to make sense of this world rather than to impose. So for me, it's not a Bible. I don't preach circulation. For me, circulation then is a problem. And I try to look at it to see how do things circulate and what happens, what is the price that you pay when things circulate? What does it mean for something to become universal? It's not universal. So if it is universally accepted, what are the costs of doing this, and how then do people begin to accept things? And what are the power structures? Because also many times, of course, things are imposed on others. Like for instance, units of measure. You have international bodies that control these things and which impose different measure systems on others. So here again, there are power structures involved in all this. And you begin then to see how everything holds together and how much you have to move one side or the other, make compromises, change modify your ideas, ally yourself with others, etc., in order for knowledge actually to circulate. And when it circulates, it is not what you started off with. So I think my half hour that I gave to myself is now over. We could talk about various examples, but I'd like now for us to be able to interact so that I can respond in a way to your questions. And if Isabella wants to, to summarize a little bit.
Yeah,
and,
Professor just like Anna said, I will summarize a little in Portuguese, and then I go straight with my questions. And then just to start the discussion, Anna will talk as well, and then we will grab the questions from the audience.
Okay.
For you. Okay. A sec, I will control my time and start in Portuguese, ok? Bem, então eu vou fazer uma breve sumarização, um breve resumo, né, do que o professor Raj discutiu com a gente hoje, né? Ele buscou centralizar a discussão em torno da circulação de conhecimento, né? Um conceito que está justamente no nosso título da conferência de hoje. Então, ele começou justamente falando sobre a sua concepção de circulação de conhecimento, para em seguida colocar num debate mais amplo, né, e se posicionar diante desse debate. O professor Raj começou a palestra dizendo, né, que o conhecimento, de falar sobre circulação de conhecimento, não é somente falar sobre coisas que se movem, como seria dinheiro, transações bancárias ou de objetos, mas que a circulação, ela sempre envolve uma transformação, né? Então, devemos ficar atentos para não entender somente circulação como algo que se move, né? E ele também ponderou a respeito disso, mencionando a sua experiência universitária e também como historiador da ciência, estando na Índia, né? E dizendo como também era visto de maneira muito incômoda essa ciência europeia, essa ciência moderna, como algo que viria da Europa e se moveria sem transformação para ser inserida em contextos não europeus, né? Essa maneira de se mover sem transformação também pode ser chamada de difusionismo, né, pensada como difusão. Então haveria centros de difusão a partir dos quais esse conhecimento se espalharia, né? Ele também ponderou sobre alguns autores que começaram a olhar também a existência de ciência fora do contexto europeu, destacando o trabalho de influência marxista de Joseph Needham, mencionando que Needham ele relaciona a ciência moderna ao surgimento do capitalismo devido à questão da quantificação. Ao mesmo tempo que ele estudou a ciência chinesa, né, trazendo-a para o debate, ele ainda a relacionava com os parâmetros europeus. Então, a ciência moderna ela se espalharia, ela se moveria, mas o seu centro ainda seria a Europa, já que a ciência moderna ela se relacionaria com a quantificação e, consequentemente, com o surgimento do capitalismo, que foi na Europa, né? Ele disse também, né, que na sua experiência ele começou a considerar essa necessidade de pensar uma racionalidade fora da Europa, porque esses europeus, essas missões científicas que se dizem espalhar uma ciência universal que somente se moveriam, ele vai falar como nos estudos de caso, nos arquivos, a gente consegue perceber que esses europeus chegam nos contextos não europeus com muito pouco conhecimento e muita pouca clareza do que eles querem estudar. Então, os agentes locais, guias, tradutores, desenhistas, produtores de mapa, eles são guias, eles são fundamentais para que esse conhecimento seja feito, e isso é algo que deve ser levado em conta numa pesquisa historiográfica, né? O professor Raj também destacou como o conhecimento é algo que está sempre sendo negociado, não é algo standardizado, como uma perspectiva de história da ciência positivista diria, né? Essa perspectiva positivista pensaria o conhecimento como pequenos tijolinhos que seriam acumulados para a gente edificar uma grande construção do saber. Essa é a visão positivista, que o professor e outros autores e autoras também se opõem, e ele vai destacar como a negociação ela é parte fundamental da produção de conhecimento, já que ela envolve o encontro entre diferentes agentes esses que estão em movimento. Então, esse destaque no movimento, ele vai falar do conhecimento como prática negociada, como algo em constante transformação, como algo em constante movimento, que vai e volta, né? Então, o movimento, ele é parte fundamental para pensar essa circulação de conhecimento. O professor também destacou uma virada historiográfica nos anos 1970 e 80, falando justamente de uma oposição a essa visão positivista, né? Esse olhar pensando sempre a questão local do conhecimento, como eles se moveriam, os esforços feitos para isso. Nesse movimento, os anos 80, o professor menciona o trabalho do Bruno Latour com a teoria Torrede, né, que destaca como seria necessário convencer as pessoas da relevância do seu conhecimento, que a verdade não seria algo inerente, mas sim uma coisa que também estaria sendo elaborada e negociada junto com o processo de conhecimento, que haveriam várias estratégias, e o professor concluiu justamente mencionando a relevância de pensar essas próprias estratégias e dar um destaque particular à circulação, vista como ela é realizada em cada momento, né? Então, o que negociar significaria em cada mundo, em cada contexto, em cada momento, o que isso significaria para as pessoas, e ele justamente também, para finalizar, né, disse que a questão da circulação e transformação de conhecimento, né, ver o conhecimento como algo necessariamente em transformação e circulação, não é algo que ele prega como algo fechado, mas sim algo que deve inspirar a nossa ida aos arquivos. Ana, tudo bem?
Okay. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very, very interesting. I would like to hear more about negotiations, especially in relation to power structures. I ask this because although it is possible to recognize circulations and transformations based diffusion, I think are you hear me?
Yeah, I'm hearing. Yeah.
Okay. I thought. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think we still have, of course, international hierarchies about what is legitimated science and what is not. Even though we know that knowledge that circulates causes changes in colonial and metropolitan areas. What do you think about this? Is that possible for us with this studies that you related, your studies and others? It is possible to change this colonial and metropolitan international hierarchy about science? Do you think it's possible? I will say in Portuguese this question only for the audience.
No, I can understand. Yeah.
Em português, a pergunta é sobre estruturas de poder internacionais, porque a gente tem estudos de história da ciência que tentam mostrar que o conhecimento colonial chegou às áreas metropolitanas e um modificou o outro via negociação, como ele mostra, mas, infelizmente, ainda existem essas estruturas, e eu queria ouvi-lo sobre elas. Thank you, Professor. Can you talk now, please?
Yeah. Okay, so your question basically is about the hierarchies in present day science. Is that, I mean, that's what you're talking about, and as to whether we can get rid of them.
Yes.
And okay, I would love to get rid of them, but I don't think we ever can, because I mean, let me be very blunt about this. In every society, you have knowledge hierarchies. But, I mean, this is not just a question of today. It's not a question of colonialism. In every society, it's very difficult to talk about Brazil as a society because Brazil was constituted only through colonialism in a way. Okay, but if you look at any other society, you always have different stratifications of knowledge, people doing different things. You have power in knowledge. Like, for instance, if you look at the practice of medicine in the Sahel, in Africa, what do you see over here? The medical practitioners are people who have an immense amount of power. They're the ones who are closest to the state structures of these societies, the tribal structures. They're the ones, and they control things. They can throw people out. They can, if, for instance, someone is practicing something which they don't like, they can label this as evil practice. This is how, for instance, the history of witches. Sorcière?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So are witches just basically cruel people, or are they stupid? No. I mean, these are people whose knowledge is outlawed by others. They can also pay for this with their lives. So in every society, what you see is hierarchies. In our world, which is a world of international science, in the sense, just look at this. I'm Indian. I'm sitting in Paris. I'm talking to you in Sao Paulo. We met in Salvador. We could perhaps meet in Bangkok next year or in Singapore. Even in our world, which is not, this is not high science, but even for us, the very fact that we are talking over here, that we are trying to discuss all this, takes for granted that there are systems within which there's an infrastructure within which this is possible. There's also a language that we are speaking, which is again a language of imperialism. We are not speaking your language. You're not okay, this is one of my languages, like Portuguese is one of your languages, but it's not, again, it's a language which has a certain history. And why is Portuguese not the international language? Why is it English, which is the international language? Is again a question of inter-imperial.
That's it.
Okay. And so what we have to do is actually always be conscious of all these things. So when we talk about something which is international, then we have to open the black box to see how is it maintained this way. And today, to think that it is just international and because of the language it is Western or European, I don't think so. because the number of Indians and Brazilians and Mexicans and Ghanaians and Nigerians and Singaporeans and Chinese who are working in all this, and perhaps, I mean, much of what we're doing, I don't know where StreamYard is governed by, who looks after this, but it just might be a Chinese product, okay? I mean, they were like everything else. It can be in English, but that doesn't mean. So we have to be conscious of these things, and we also have to be conscious as to the interaction between our world and. So it's not binary. It's not just that because there are these structures, we just have to submit to them. We are also, in a way, resisting. We're subverting things. We're changing things. We're changing their uses. We're doing all sorts of things, and we're also trying in some way to modify standards and say, okay, this standard won't work. This is, and it's difficult. It's difficult to do things against, you know, established structures, but that doesn't mean that you can't do these things. It just means that there is power. I don't think we can, when Foucault says that, the knowledge, about knowledge and power being a duality. He's not talking about today. For him, it's a precondition of knowledge. Knowledge is power, and it is asymmetrical in every society. That's a part of, at least, I mean, we don't know of any egalitarian society so far.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, but there's no society in which this knowledge power equation doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have knowledge for the sake of knowledge anywhere in any society.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, take away European societies, just look at, sort of pre-European cultures, what we know of them, what we know of how things were working, and you see, yes, everywhere there are power structures. And some people's knowledge is more valued than other people's knowledge. So, and of course, it's not the same thing. This, as historians, we have to be careful. It's not as if, sort of pre-colonial societies and today's societies are the same. No, certain things, in the sense that this, power and knowledge is always there, but how it actually manifests itself, what's going on over here, changes. And our world is, of course, much more complex. It has to be held by so many different things. So, and but we have to, this does not mean that we resign ourselves to this. That's what I'm saying. It's not as if we say, okay, it's like this and it's like this. No, it is like this, and this does not stop us from trying to change things and fight against these structures. But then you have to get over the illusion that if you do this, you get to another society in which there'll be none. No, there'll be other forms. That's all. We're changing from one form to another form.
Okay.
Yeah, and maybe it's better for us to change certain things because there are certain monopolies that you can't, which are unlivable, and we have to get rid of them. But we have to also be, which doesn't mean that we should not be, that there should be no idealism, that there should be no utopia, Yeah, of course we should, we should fight for, for less or for none of this to happen. But it's not as if we can ever fight for, in realistic terms, what I'm saying is it doesn't work that way.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you very much. Eu acho que as respostas a gente não precisa traduzir porque elas estão muito claras.
Tá bom, sim.
Isabella will ask you some. Isabella.
So, Professor, thank you. It's my turn. I would like to do 2 short questions for you. The first one would be a personal interest that I have. You talked a lot about the negotiation, the crucial role played by the negotiations. I'm particularly mostly interested in these negotiations in the local sphere, because we see the British Empire agents negotiating with the local ones. But could you see in your archive work with the historical sources these conflicts, negotiations among the local folks, among the local people? The local people are in some sort of conflict, trying to, I don't know, some just try. I think just trying to avoid this unique view about the local. You know, there are dissonant voices. I'm interested to hear more about it because I like this
Okay.
discussion. The second one is that also about negotiation is a concept that we see in Bruno Latour, as you said. And in your point of view, negotiations should have a broader perspective than Latour made. For you, maybe the Latourian negotiations are kind of uptight in a model for you. What do you think about your view of negotiation towards Latour's view of negotiation? And that's my two questions.
Yeah,
Thank
okay. Well, thank you very much. So, if I understand your first question, it's about negotiations not just between Europeans and non-Europeans, but also outside of this,
Yeah.
within different communities
Mm-hmm.
in anywhere. So, let me start also by saying that this negotiation takes place within Europe itself.
Yeah.
Just imagine, I mean, say for instance, a botanist. A botanist has to work with a gardener. Huh?
Yeah.
And these two people, they're looking at the same plant, but they don't look at it in the same way. And there is a hierarchy over here. The botanist is superior to the gardener.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He gets more money. He can tell the gardener, you do this. And the gardener says, no, I can't do this because this is not the way in which things work. If you do this, you'll kill the plant. Okay. You just leave this to me. And finally, the two of them, I mean, and the gardener will not do anything in the way in which the botanist wants to do things, but there is a hierarchy. He has to do things, otherwise, he's going to lose his job. Okay? I mean, so, and this is outside of colonialism. I'm just telling you, this is local. This is in the botanical gardens, for instance. This is what's happening. So if you say no, you're out. So you have to say yes. But if you say yes and do what the botanist does, you're out also because the plant will die. And the botanist will say it's your fault. Okay? So you're negotiating in a way, both sides are trying to pull things their way. And finally, something happens which makes that plant live, but in a different way from either what the botanist was thinking of or what the gardener was thinking of. So here is the negotiation. You see, now this sort of thing you can also find in archives when you start looking at it's the European archives themselves that tell you a lot about what's happening locally. Because, okay, so let me give you one example. This example is from a late 17th century botanical manuscript which comes from India, which is called the Hortus Indicus Malabaricus. It's made by, it's the work, in fact, it's put together by a Dutchman called Van Rede. Now, Van Rede is a military man. He has no idea of plants. Okay? I mean, that's not his field. But he conquers, I mean, he is the general in charge of the conquest of the Portuguese colony of Cochin. So he defeats the Portuguese, and this becomes a Dutch colony. Kochi. And he gets orders from Amsterdam saying, now that you've got this place, you have to make an inventory of everything that we can export from here. The reason why they're in India is because of spices and because of plants. I mean, that is what early colonialism is all about. So he has to make a whole inventory of everything. But as I said, he's a military man. He has no idea of how he's going to do this. So it so happens that there is one group of people in the local government, although it was a Portuguese colony, but the Portuguese were not directly administrating it. It was administered by a local king and his court. So the Portuguese get replaced by the Dutch, but the local court is still there. So this guy, Van Reyder, contacts the local court and says, listen, this is what we want. The local court, of course, I mean, they also want this because for them, this brings money in. I mean, if they give this inventory, then they'll have contracts with the Dutch. And then you begin to see what's happening because these guys are in government, so they're sitting in government, but three of them happen to be physicians, local physicians. And they know a lot about the plants. I mean, they know about the properties of the plants, but they don't know the plants themselves. I mean, no physician. I mean, you know about the what the plant does, but you don't. I mean, you're not going to go and fetch the plant. You have other people to do that. And then when you open this thing, you forget about So on the one hand, you have this man who looks after, who initiates the project. There's an end to the project, which is the book, which comes from Amsterdam also. But within the two, you have this whole world, which is a world of the local completely, but this local is also a world of the Portuguese. Because even though the Portuguese have been defeated, the local administration works, the writing is Portuguese. Everything is written in Portuguese. But by Indians. So again, the local is a transformed local. It's not as if you come back to any form of, there's no original local. These are locals which are being transformed all the time.
I see.
But you see all these differences. Then you see how orders are being given, who's doing what are the power structures over here. And it's through this one text, you begin actually to see the whole world of this place open up through the local. And suddenly it's as if, the Dutch have disappeared. While you're doing this. Of course, they're there. They're always there because it's because of them that this is happening. And so this is what, and you have lots of these sorts of cases. So the point is, how deep do you go? If you're just going to look at the surface, if you're going to you stay with the European and the non-European, you're not going to see this. You then have to see who are these people, who is he dealing with? And then you ask the same question. I mean, if the question is, if I'm going to come to you and say, hey, listen, can you, are you Brazilian? Can you should know this. But what are you going to do? I mean, it's not because you're Brazilian that you know everything about Brazil. You're going to go and see someone else.
Yeah.
So then exactly. And then you open up the black box and you begin to see how everything works and the negotiations that are taking place over there and the hierarchies over there as well. The caste hierarchies, because, in India, we have also, it's not just, power structures, which are power structures because of the politics of the place. They're also, the social power structures. So someone can be very poor, but if he's high caste, then he has, and someone can be very rich, but of low caste, and you have to take into account all these different things. So it's also a work of anthropology at the same time. It's complex, And it's difficult many times to do this work on your own. You need other people who can help look at this. And the more you do this, the more you begin to see that you need collective work for this. This is not, I mean, I start with a simple idea, but then the more you get into it, the more you begin to see that there are limits that one person can do, which doesn't mean that these limits are there for everyone. I mean, the point is, how do we then organize ourselves to be able to do things and get beyond our own limits? Okay, so your next question was about Latour. Now, with Latour, my problem is that, actor network theory is based on two variables. So it's a network, huh? And the network has two variables. Any network theory is based on two things. One is the density of the network, how many people are involved in it. And the other question is the centrality of the network. How central is it? And basically, as a scientist, your interest is to be as central as possible, so that the most number of people cite you, so that you have the most amount of power, so that you are the one, and it's your ideas that everyone follows. So there is a lot of negotiation involved over here, but to what extent is that negotiation actually about the content of what you're doing, or is it a negotiation of power? Is it a negotiation where I'm trying to convince you to become my disciple? So that every time you say something, every time you use the word circulation, you say Kapil Raj. Or is this saying, okay, the idea was Kapil Raj's, but we've done this and this with it, and it's transformed. And this is not what Bruno was talking about. For Bruno, it was, how do you maintain control over the network? And this also has to do with his idea of centers of calculation. So you have to become a center. And in your negotiation, you have to give as little as possible. Because otherwise, if you give too much, then you're no longer the center. Yeah.
Okay.
It's self-defeating. I mean, it's, you understand.
Yeah.
It's the logic of the network, of the network theory, of actor network theory. It's a way of, it's a strategy of gaining as much power as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, which is not at all so that's where we are completely on different wavelengths.
Okay.
Yeah, I understand him as a sociologist, because this is what many scientists are trying to do. Yeah. This you read this all the time. This is the work. If I want to just suggest, I want to analyze what scientists do, this is perfect. But if I try to analyze what knowledge, how knowledge is moving, what's actually happening, and how that affects us, then it's a different question. If this is, how do you win this game? It's like, if someone were to write a book, how do you always become the best scientist in the world? Then you read Bruno Latour, and you try to follow these things. Yeah, it's a good recipe. Whereas what I'm trying to do is just to see how people actually do things. What's going on over here. For him, it is, how do you acquire power? Which comes back to your question, Anna. Yeah. So if you want to maintain that, if that is what, then Latour is giving you a perfect recipe. If on the other hand, you're trying to analyze things, how they happen, and try to see what makes sense, and also for us then to have strategies how to get beyond certain things, then it's different.
Perfect, Professor.
Does that make sense?
Totally. Total
Perfect sense.
Perfect, Professor. Thank you. Have you finished? Sorry, I don't know.
Yeah.
No. Professor, I'm really glad with your answer. Thank you very much. I was thinking about a lot in the things that you thought. It's food for thought for us here. And then we have one question from the audience, two questions, in fact. I will start with one, and then after your answer, we go to the next. The first one was sent by Professor Marcel Vin. And Professor Marcel Vin said, I would like to hear more about how to access the different voices that emerge from traditional historical documents. That is, those produced by groups or individuals who often represent colonialism and capitalism. Wouldn't it be essential for the historian to actively seek out documents produced by these other voices?
Yeah, it's very difficult to find documents which are produced by other voices. Why do they, the first thing is, why do people want to produce documents anyway? Other voices or not other voices, why do you produce a document? You produce a document in a certain logic. Most of the things, like for instance, I was talking to you about the gardener. The gardener does not produce documents. The only time he produces a document is his voice. Actually, you only hear it when he talks to someone who produces documents. Because, it's even in our own negotiations. If you go into a physics laboratory or any kind of hard science laboratory, most people are talking to each other, informally. They perhaps write emails to each other, but most of the times they're also sitting around and chatting and sort of, doing things, or perhaps making, Zoom calls with each other like this. And the document doesn't actually get produced. The document gets produced when there's a certain logic within which you need to produce a document. Many times these are bureaucratic procedures. You have to prove something, you have to show something. I was telling you about Van Reyder. The reason why he has to produce all this documentation is that he feels himself, he's a military man. He's asked to produce an inventory of plants and of medicines. He doesn't know anything about this. So he starts his description by saying, I joined the army when I was 14, the Navy, and I've spent all my life on sea. And I know nothing about this field. So I have to tell you how I got this information and how this information is actually reliable information. Okay, if you ask me something and I say I know nothing about it, and yet I have to produce something, there's a pressure on me to produce something which would be reliable, which you can believe in. So I have to tell you how I got this information. Who gave it to me? What are the credentials of this person? Did I find this by going to the closest pub, having a drink with someone who says, okay, here's a list of things, and then you go back and do this? No. So you need to actually work out all the, trustworthy sources, and you have to tell them about all these things. So it is by opening up all this that you get all these other voices then. So the voices are very rarely first-hand voices. This is what a historian called Mark Bloch says many times, in his book, which is called The Historian's Craft. He says there are two kinds of sources. One are intentional sources, where you have to write this, it's written in this way, and the other are non-intentional sources. You don't want to write about, this is not what you're interested in, but then you have to write it because of some reason or the other. So many times, and what's his name, Carlo Ginzburg. You've heard of Carlo Ginzburg, for instance, the microhistorian. He uses this a lot in his own work. So he's looking at Jesuit sources, but through the Jesuit sources, he's or the Inquisition sources. He gets about what very local people are doing. How do you get that? So it's someone else who's writing about something, and then you have to pick this up, interpret it, and then reconstitute that world. So, and also Walter Benjamin, he calls this reading against the grain. So you don't read as, the text says, but you have to go behind the text to see what's going on over here. And that's how you reconstitute these things. Because many times it's very difficult to find, we always say, yeah, I wish we had the same sources on the other side. No, I mean, because these sources are also produced in certain logics, the ones that we do have. And okay, maybe we'll find other sources, I don't know, but we have to make do with what we have. We have to keep looking for other sources. Of course, I mean, I have found other sources, but you always look for, the other sources are suggested by these sources themselves, and then you go behind them and you see what's going on. Many times it's also by accident that suddenly, someone is talking about something, and then you see that this is a very rich source, but it's not meant for what you were doing. It's in a different context. Perhaps in a religious context, someone is talking about something and, okay, this is what it means. Mm-hmm. And there again, it comes back to what I finished with, but when I was telling you that this is, this has now become if we want to do this sort of work, it's collective labor. It's collaborative work, because it's beyond us as just mere historians of science. We need anthropologists with us, we need other historians, we need cultural historians, we need economic historians, we need all kinds of other people. And it's by collaborations that we can get behind, things to see. Imagine also what kinds of sources we could get for doing this, because it's not, it's not as if it's an isomorphism. What we have over here, we should be able to find over there. No. These are different cultures also. Even intellectual cultures are very different in different places, and how they write and how they produce and why they should be writing or not is again, these are cultural values.
Thank you. We have here 2 questions, and I will propose that during the next question, we close the questions because of time, okay? You're going to do 2 questions more. Isabella, can you read, please?
Oh, of course, Ana. I thought maybe, okay, 2 questions. The first one from Helena Ramalho, that is here with us.
Helena Ramalho I think she is only writing the questions from the chat.
Let's see.
It's from Julia Cristiano.
From Julia Cristiano. Okay, yes. I messed up here.
I can read.
Okay.
Does the circulation of objects and knowledge allow us to study them through a new methodology? Would transnational history be that methodology, or do you see it more as a historiographical perspective?
Ooh, the difficult question.
Julia Cristiano is
it's not, there's no methodology involved. There is a methodology, yes. And the methodology is the methodology of circulation itself. In other words, if you want to study the circulation of objects, then you have to follow these objects as they move around. And where Julia is right is by suggesting that this would be a transnational history. In other words, these are histories which cross frontiers. I mean, because when things travel, it's like diseases. I mean, COVID doesn't respect frontiers. So if you want to study it, you have to move across domains. In other words, you also have to move across cultures, you have to move across languages. Suppose, you have someone in the 16th century who is in Goa. And so his work has to do not just with Goa, because he's also writing to Lisbon, but the documents are going through Salvador, and there's someone over there, and so it's much more complex. And by the 17th century, you have Angola as well, and you have all these people who are moving around as well. They start off in one place, then they go and start in another place, in a third place, and they have different methods and ways of doing things. So you have to respect this. And the methodology then becomes the methodology of circulation is in itself a transnational methodology, because it does not respect, it's like following diseases. You cannot follow diseases if you're going to impose frontiers from the outside. So so basically, yeah. And that is where Bruno Latour and I are very, we have a lot in common, which is that in both cases, his idea also is to follow people around.
Yes. Thank you very much.
But again, which also means that this is a difficult thing, because it means that you also move across languages again, so every time you see how limited the thing is for one person. You have to work in collaboration with others.
Yeah, the collaboration work seems to be crucial in this.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's not just and again over here, collaboration again means negotiations with others. Yeah, and you have to be in fact reflexive in this in your own way, and be prepared to do that, and not sort of say, I want you to do this and I want you to do this. No, you begin also to see how things, that you yourself are in the whole same process of circulation and making your own knowledge.
Yeah, of course. Also interesting, Professor. Thank you. So we will close with the Elena Ramalho's question.
Yeah.
She said, Professor, you mentioned the cost involved in the circulation of knowledge as a reflection that goes beyond the academic sphere. I see the internet as an important opportunity to democratize access to knowledge. However, I also believe that this speed, while broadening reach, can compromise the depth and accuracy of ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. In a way, it does democratize knowledge, because access to knowledge, because of this, we all know that we can also, we have access to just so many different things through internet. I can sit in my room over here and get documents from the 16th century on my computer, which was not possible 20 years ago. You didn't even know that these documents existed. And you had to ask for money, you had to go travel, you had to go to different archives here and there. And now many of these things you can get by sitting around. But there are also limits to this, exactly as, so while it compromises definitely not only the, as I said, how do you it's not enough to have access to a document. More than having access to a document, you need basically to be able to understand what that document says. And for that, you need to have closer contact with people sitting, working together, complicities, which are not, where there are limits. For instance, I can have a conversation with you on Zoom or on StreamYard, uh, but it has its limits. On the other hand, if I am in the same institution, physically in the same space, there is a certain complicity which comes up. You suddenly say, okay, there's this idea. You begin to see things, and this is one of the reasons why we're all fighting today for, so that Zoom does not become our new mode of communication. Because what happens when people actually sort of get together, and the kind of knowledge that is transmitted is completely, it's of a different quality.
And also the documents, Professor, because I always think you were talking about the document, the intentional documents and no intentional documents, and if you get this document out of his original place,
Exactly, the context.
It's different.
The
The
context
context changes, don't you think?
Exactly, absolutely. So, I mean, when you decontextualize things,
Yes.
so there are limits. Of course, on the one hand, if you know what the context is and you get the document, yes.
Yes, because of that, it's democratizing, but it's possible for us to look for the circulation with these digitalized documents, but we lose something in the context.
Exactly. And there are limits immediately to this,
Yes.
Yeah. So even in the old days, I remember, because I could go only once every year at best, or once every 2 years, to the archives. But when you're in the archives, you're sitting there and suddenly there's someone sitting next to you. And of course, I mean, as usual, you look to see what the other person is reading. No? And suddenly you find something which, what is this? Or someone comes to you and says, are you Kapil Raj? And you start talking, and this person, you say, but I mean, you're not a historian of science. Why do you know me and stuff? And then you find that, there are things, because people have read you, and through what you've said about something, they've got another idea in their own field. And then you go out for coffee, or you go out, for some time, and you yourself get enriched by what this person is doing. There's a feedback immediately. It's not just, and this is something which you get only when you're when there's a kind of physical proximity with people who are also reading these documents. You get new suggestions. Exactly as you said, it's limited. You don't have the context, and that context perhaps can be given by someone who's working on something quite different, but who's got that context. And many of these things are accidental.
And that's the happiness of our
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Totally, Professor. I just to close with a commentary. This also highlights the political place of the university, colleges, and schools as places that gather people, put people together.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The political relevance of this meeting, the Zoom is also important. Of course, we're using StreamYard now. Okay.
No, but absolutely. And this is one of the things that we really have to fight against, with the generalization of these sorts of things. Okay, I'm glad that we have this so that I can be sitting here in Paris and talking to you. Yeah. But within limits, we cannot generalize this. This cannot be something which becomes, has a wider use than this.
It was better when we were in Salvador.
Yeah, of course, because I mean, and the kinds of, it's the quality of conversation. Maybe it's on the one hand it can be very banal, and in that banality it's exactly the same thing. The intention might be banal, but then you have the non-intentional which comes up. Because
Professor, amazing. Good.
Professor, thank you very much.
Well, I hope this was not. I mean, it was of some use. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it was very important for our research group. We are more or less 20 persons talking every day about history of public health, history of science.
Yeah, good. So yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of complicity.
Yes. So
Yeah,
we thank you very much for the
you're
contribution
welcome.
of the
You're
lecture. It
welcome.
was very, very important. And I will say some for the audience in the end, but if you want to say some to finish.
Well, I mean, for me, it also. I mean, the questions were really very, very interesting and very. Yeah, because it shows that there's it's more than just formal questions. These are questions which are deeply ingrained also in people's own work, and yeah,
Okay.
it's a pity that that we have to stop. I mean, I would love to sort of spend more time actually, but I mean, again, but not in this. These are there are limits to this
Yeah,
discussion. Perhaps
this,
another
this
time in Sao Paulo.
yeah. This
Yeah,
conversation will go on,
yeah,
Professor. I'm sure
exactly.
about it.
Okay,
So thank you very much.
you're
Thank you,
welcome. It was
audience.
a pleasure.
It's a pleasure for us. I thank you and the audience for the presence, for the question, which were very, very good questions. E eu gostaria de terminar dizendo para a audiência que a Helena, que estava organizando lá o chat, ela disse que aqueles que não conseguiram se inscrever para entrar em contato com ela por e-mail. Ela colocou o e-mail dela lá no chat, tá bom? Então, muito obrigada a todos. Eu encerro por aqui. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for attending and for being present. Yeah.
Obrigada.
Thank you,
Okay.
Professor.
And thanks for your invitation once again, Anna and Isabella, for your presentation.
We thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks,
Bye.
Professor.
Okay.
It
Take
was
care.
a
Bye.
pleasure. It was a pleasure.